today. This is a meeting for our study on the global state of the free press. And I would note for members that this meeting, we are having Spanish translation. So you may have some moments of silence before and after your remarks. That's when the Spanish translator is translating for the witnesses. So don't just jump in right away with your next comment. Allow the translation. So just give it a little bit more time so that we can accommodate the Spanish translation. And we're very pleased today to have with us by video conference from Venezuela. We have Carlos Correa and Amado Vivas, and they are both with Espacio Público, which is a Venezuelan NGO that promotes free expression and freedom of information. And we also have by video conference Edison Antonio Lanza Robato, who is Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So welcome to all of our witnesses, and we will start with our witnesses who are in Venezuela. We'll start, you will have 10 minutes combined, so you may choose which one of you wishes to speak first, or if one of you wants to speak for both. So go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to participate in this meeting. My name is Carlos Correa, and I am the director of Espacio Público. Since the beginning of the government of Hugo Chavez, the government has identified independent media as a political enemy. The criminalization of journalistic coverage has facilitated attacks against the media. And we have also seen impunity in cases of violence against journalists and a normalization of blocking or obstacles in the way of coverage, as well as restrictions that complicate the situation for the media in Venezuela and their ability for people to have access to information. Since 2002 until now, we have recorded more than 1,000 cases of violence, harassment, and attacks against the media and journalists in the past 17 years. This enabled there to be institutional mechanisms of restriction through arbitrary administration of telecommunication restrictions. There have been sanctions, closing of sources of the media, censorship by enforcing a change in editorial lines, or firing a large number of journalists. There has been pressure to eliminate people who voice criticism of the government, and these cases have come up to more than 1,800 violations of the right to freedom of expression, which represents 51% of the cases that we have registered since 2002. In 2017 alone, when there were large protests against the national government in Venezuela, 61 sources of media were closed. That represents 32% of all the sources of media that were closed during 2002. And we have recorded 193 sources of media that have been closed up until 2018. These massive closures of the media, which happened increasingly, have significantly restricted traditional media, specifically those that reach the greatest number of people, such as television and radio. By December 2018, 10 states in the country, or 10 provinces, no longer had print media because there was a lack of paper for printing, which has been significant, has been affecting independent media for the past 5 years. This is a result of the state monopoly for the distribution of paper for print media. The arbitrary administration of public resources discriminates and punishes those that participate in independent journalism. Newspapers with more than 80 years have stopped distribution because their editorial line was critical of the government. Restrictions on covering incidents on what is happening on the street results in the detention of journalists. Only in January of 2019, 20 members of the press were detained for the coverage that they were carrying out. Officials have normalized obstacles for journalists carrying out their work or for recording incidents of public interest, especially when these officials are involved in the repression or violation of human rights. These limitations forced Venezuelans to use the internet in order to have access to information. However, Venezuela has the slowest internet speed in the region. It is only 2 gigabytes. And so the same obstacles that we were seeing with journalism, we started to see online. There are digital blogs or massive blogs against social media on days when there are protests. There have also been detentions for publishing information online. 23 people were detained in 2018 and 53 people since 2009. These are an example of the threats that we have been able to record. And this threatens the free distribution of ideas and information, and it generates self-censorship in people because they're afraid of the consequences. Currently, most people in Venezuela don't know what is happening in the moment. The lack of space for information and disinformation spread by government increases uncertainty and diminishes public informed debate, which is necessary to overcome the crisis and to recover democratic institutions. An example that is important to mention is the journalists in Univision. Yesterday, they had an interview with the president. They were detained, and all the information they had obtained had been deleted. And last night, they were told that they would be deported. Thank you very much.
Did you like to speak as well? You have 4 more minutes. No?
Vamos para las preguntas y compartimos entre los dos.
That's everything. We can wait until questions, and we will answer questions together.
Well, thank you very much. And therefore, we will now go to Edison Antonio Lanza Robato, who is coming to us by video conference from Washington. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam. I wanted to thank to the committee for this invitation to expose about the situation of freedom of expression in Venezuela. I want to shift to Spanish to better understand it. Quiero referirme en esta.
During my presentation, I would like to speak about 2 examples with regards to the situation of freedom of expression in Venezuela. In first place, about the situation of the coverage that journalists are trying to carry out with regards to the current humanitarian crisis, and with regards to the de facto government that came into power January 10th in the name of Nicolas Maduro. And I would like to provide more details about the violations of these freedoms since 2018. And I would also like to mention that the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the IACHR every year publishes an annual report regarding the situation of freedom of expression. And there's a chapter specifically about Venezuela, and I recommend that you read it, where you will be able to find more information that pertains to my presentation. Now, with regards to freedom of expression in Venezuela, in the last 2 months, and Mr. Correa already mentioned this, the mechanisms of censorship and blocking platforms, social media, on internet multiplied, and there was an increase in the restriction of journalistic coverage. And this was all carried out by the government in Venezuela and through their telecommunications commission. During the development of this political crisis that is affecting Venezuela, several sources of media were blocked, such as YouTube and Google, and as well as access to Facebook, which has been intermittent. In different times and different moments, the Venezuelan population did not have access to information through the internet, which was reported by the media in Colombia, such as El Tiempo. During protests and events that have taken place in the last few weeks, national television in Chile and Radio Caracol were blocked from the subscription channels, and this was an order from the national CONATEL, the National Commission. We have seen these blocks happening in a systematic way for the past year. They're also blocking channels such as CNN and certain Colombian networks. Journalists and reporters from radio and television who have the broadest reach, such as Miguel Rondon, reported that their programs have been suspended and that they had lost their license as a result of the pressure that they had received from authorities. Now, the deportations of correspondents and of teams of foreign press is something that has been happening constantly for the past 4 years, and we have a record of 20 cases, as the director of Espacio Público already mentioned. But in the last 2 weeks, there are some cases that are very significant, such as cases from Reuters, the French press, and the most symbolic case, that of the journalist Jorge Ramos and his team from Univision, as a result of the questions that the president thought were uncomfortable. And that the material of that interview was destroyed. And he was detained arbitrarily during several hours, and then he was deported. In the last 2 years, journalists have also had to suffer certain repressions. For example, journalists from France and from Uruguay, and Billy Six from Germany as well, have had negative experiences. Now, this has become even more worrisome when we consider the fact that the state is applying a law, the so-called law against hate, on social media. And this has been going on for at least a year and a half. And there's the threat of imprisonment when they find what they call expressions of hate, discrimination, or terrorism. However, the definition of these circumstances are vague and ambiguous within the legislation. And it establishes penalties for people that do so. Along with the rapporteur from the United Nations, we have said that these are violations of international right and that this severely affects the ability of citizens to receive and disseminate information that is of public interest in a moment of crisis. I think that the government has expressed the idea that it is all right to punish the media for the kind of information that they are publishing, that they are in the right to block access to platforms, to take away their licenses, to deport journalists, and other violations that we have been recording, such as the discriminatory and the lack of distribution of paper for print media. During 2018, this crisis in freedom of expression significantly worsened. And the deterioration of this freedom can be seen in criminal cases that were held against people who investigate and arbitrary detentions of journalists who cover protests. It also includes the detention of leaders from the opposition who were detained because they expressed ideas or positions that were critical of the government. And this practice has been extended to citizens who use social media to provide information that is of public interest. The supposed lei against hate was also applied against protesters and other citizens with the effect of intimidating people for expressing themselves against the government. Local organizations of civil society have reported many cases of threats against journalists. Many of these people were forced to delete the material that they had recorded on their phones or on their cameras. Their equipment was confiscated. And there were also cases when foreign correspondents were expelled who were covering incidents in the country. The government has also developed new strategies to try and control the messages that are published online by blocking certain websites, by surveilling communication among citizens on social media. Now, there are some concrete examples that I would like to share with you with regards to, for example, in 2018, the Special Rapporteur
Only have 1 minute left, so if you can give the examples very quickly. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yes, no problem. I would like to refer to the journalist Ramon Mendes and Daniel Cases from French press, who were detained by the National Intelligence Service and people who have made certain accusations, such as Diosdado Cabello, and the initiation of 4 cases against people who were denounced and who were publishing stories about irregularities and corruption in Venezuela. And I would also like to mention the case of Pedro Jaimes, a Twitter user who has been detained for sharing information that was already public, and he shared that on Twitter, and the situation of two firemen in Venezuela who were arbitrarily detained for making a parody with regards to the president of Venezuela.
To all of our witnesses, and now we will start with questions, and we will start with Mr. Anderson for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. We've had a series of hearings on Venezuela in the past, and so some of these issues are familiar to us. I would just like to ask, as in 2018, you mentioned that the restrictions increased on media and journalists. Can I ask, what is the role of the neighboring countries? You talked about some of their stations being blocked and different things, licenses suspended and that. But I'm just wondering, there's been more concern amongst OAS nations about what's going on in Venezuela. What have other countries done to try to assist getting information into Venezuela? Do they respond? Do they can use other countries as a base or for relaying information, or do they help with the establishment of things like WhatsApp and Skype and those kinds of things? Could you just talk about that a little bit? Whoever wants to speak to it.
Bueno,
In Venezuela, the restrictions on international press are associated with the fact that the international media is an important medium for expression for the Venezuelans. That's why in 2014, certain channels were suspended, in 2018 as well, in 2017, and in 2009 that also occurred. it's very difficult to undertake coverage from neighboring countries. For example, with humanitarian aid, there are several Venezuelan journalists that are in Cucuta and who do not have a way of getting into Venezuela. The restrictions with regards to social media has more to do with the blocks that have been placed on certain social media, with the internet limitations in Venezuela. And that is affecting the visibility of what is happening in the country. I would like to add that there is a pattern that has been in place for the past 8 years, but that has intensified in the past few years, that journalism has been criminalized. And when a journalist or a source of media provides information within Venezuela about corruption in the government or violation of human rights, there's immediately a legal case opened up against them, and they are prohibited from leaving the country. So that becomes a significant threat, the threat that they will end up in a prison in Venezuela. And that is something that we do not wish for anyone. So as a result, many journalists prefer exile. They prefer to leave Venezuela, to not run the risk of being imprisoned for carrying out their work as journalists. And as a result, they can't return to the country. They can't come back to Venezuela. There are more than 10 Venezuelan journalists who are trying to carry out their work in Miami or in Colombia and trying to provide information about Venezuela from outside the country, with the limitations that Carlos has already mentioned. I agree. It's not the same thing to cover the situation in what is happening in the country from Miami or from Colombia than what you can cover from within Venezuela. And that has been an effort that the government has done to try and create an obstacle.
The present or the past one in Venezuela has more than one reason to be suppressing information. I'm just wondering, could you tell us a little bit about what is the average Venezuelan's level of trust in the media? Typically, the government is trying to undermine the free speech or undermining freedom of expression, alternative opinions and that. But what does the average Venezuelan think when they hear their news reports that are running through the government media? Do they trust them, or is everyone cynical?
A ver,
There has been a state policy that considers freedom of expression as an enemy. It considers critical journalism as an enemy of the state. And this is the way it has been treated with different kinds of strategies, but that's the stance that the government has had for more than 20 years, including the government of Hugo Chavez and Maduro. That policy has created in the Venezuelan society a search and an interest in alternative sources of media. So when RCTV closed, it was closed in 2009, certain frequencies were stopped working on the radio, and so people started looking for alternative sources of media online. That shows that in spite of the restrictions in Venezuela, the small spaces that do have an ability to function are the ones that are most sought after. And that supports processes such as those taken by the National Assembly. And that also supports the mobilizations, the protests that took place. However, people are not aware of all of the marches or the protests that are taking place because they don't have access to all the information. So the restrictions have created a toxic climate by this state policy, but at the same time, the society looks for information through alternative sources.
But that is time. So we'll now go to Mr. Tabara for 7 minutes.
Thank you for the witnesses for being here. And first of all, I just want to thank you for being a voice for Venezuela and for those that at this time don't have much of a voice. And it's thanks to you that we get to shed some light on the situation in Venezuela. So my first question will be to both witnesses is they mentioned in their testimonies that 193 media outlets were closed or shut down in between the beginning of the protests to 2018. What about a lot of the bloggers and independent activists that have been active in putting on social media certain posts during a lot of the protests? Have they been targeted, and have there been put restrictions on these individuals to shut down their own posts?
Rápidamente.
I'll say quickly that the government, yes, did start by blocking websites, and then it was criminalizing people who used blogs, for example. And I would like to ask Amado Vivas, my colleague, to quickly summarize the case of Pedro Jaime. Good afternoon, everyone. This is something that has affected social media. One example of this, in a case that we are personally accompanying, is the case of the Twitter user Pedro Jaime Criollo. He is a citizen who would share information on Twitter that's related to meteorology and to flight paths in Venezuela. Last year, in May, Pedro Jaime published the presidential plane's flight path, and he used a public website called flightradar24.com. After he published this information, qué pena.
We'll give it a moment, see if we can recover the video feed and the sound. But if you wanted to answer that question in the meantime, and then we can go back to them if we get them back.
Bien. Gracias. Sí.
Yes, the question is very relevant because there are two kinds of repression. The first one is the one that was mentioned, monopolizing traditional media. And if there's a lack of freedom within traditional media, bloggers and citizens started using internet more and more. And during certain years, that was a space that was much more free than traditional media. However, in the past 2 years, there have been certain attempts to control the internet as well. One of them is to selectively go after bloggers such as Pedro Jaime, and I will allow my colleagues to continue speaking about that. But there's also the Constituent Assembly, which is a controversial group for the way that it was established within the government of Venezuela, has approved a draconian law called the Law Against Hate on social media, which is the first law of its kind in the hemisphere, and establishes up to 20 years in jail for people who the government considers for disseminating messages of hate that are subversive online. And we know what this represents, such a vague and ambiguous law. And they have tried to apply this law against ordinary citizens who have simply been critical of the government. And this is in addition to mechanisms that we've already mentioned. Intermittent blocks on social media during days of protests. So freedom of expression is also being limited online, which is in addition to another legislative project the government has tried to carry it out with regards to cyber terrorism. It is also a project that penalizes or criminalizes freedom of expression online.
Señor Vivas, quisiera terminar entonces y quisiéramos darle la bienvenida de nuevo.
Caso de Pedro Jaime, básicamente lo.
Yes, basically, there is very selective surveillance in social media that affects these citizens particularly. And Jaimes, because he shared public information, is now subject to a possible penalty of up to 30 years in prison, which is the maximum penalty in Venezuela. In addition, he is now subject to prosecution in which, of course, the judges lack any independence.
Left, Mr. Tabara.
Just real quick, I would.
Muy rápidamente quisiera mencionar que a nuestros testigos que lo siguiente, ¿dirían ustedes que en los últimos tres presidentes, digamos, Coladra, Chávez y Maduro, hemos visto una disminución de la libertad de prensa? Porque decían que en los 60...
In terms of this free press.
Very quick responses, please. Go ahead.
Yo brevemente, mientras que
Yes, very briefly.
no, brevemente quiero
Yes, very briefly, I'd like to mention that both the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the Special Rapporteur have been reporting on this situation since around the year 2002, 2003 to the present date. And some cases are emblematic. Perhaps early in the regime, around 15 years ago, the mechanisms were more sophisticated and they had a guise of due process. For example, the removal of permits for television chains such as RCTV were done through allegations by the president that they had participated in an attempted coup in the year 2002. They didn't furnish any evidence. However, there was a judicial process and their license to broadcast was removed. This was done with radio stations as well and through the crimes of perjury and defamation. However, the situation now has become de facto, namely without any type of official
Time for that. You can revisit that in a future question, but now we'll go to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to elaborate on what we've been already discussing and ask you to think a little bit about how we can contribute to this discussion here with our understanding of media ownership and how media ownership has evolved, even as we were hearing from Mr. Robato about some of the legislative changes that were made in the last 15 years with regards to permits and broadcasting. Can you share with us a little bit of information, maybe over the last 15 years, the media ownership landscape, and media ownership being the traditional forms of media, state-sponsored and independent. Also, because I'm going to tell you my question and we'll use up all of my time. The other thing to think about is as people have left the country and how has media presence and media ownership been contributed to from neighboring countries? Maybe let's start with Mr. Robato and then we can move on.
Sí, con mucho gusto.
Yes, gladly. The situation of media ownership is that we have documented is related to two phenomena. On the one hand, the expansion of state-owned media managed directly by the government. And Carlos may help me here, but there are around 10 different television stations that are directly controlled by the state and that broadcast only the official discourse, so to speak. On the other hand, licenses have been removed from some of the most important broadcasters in Venezuela, such as RCTV, which was doubtlessly the #1 private TV channel, and it was handed over to a state media outlet. On the other hand, there is also a procurement and acquisition mechanism of private media outlet by front companies or entrepreneurs that are close to the government for amounts that are very high. There is a case, for instance, now of Global Vision, which is under investigation by the United States government, where the editorial line shifted after it was the outlet was purchased by an entrepreneur that was close to the government. And these are some examples in recent years. There have been pressures, for instance, for media outlets to fire journalists who are critical or independent. Also, radio and television programs that are not to the government's liking have been closed. This has also asphyxiated freedom of expression in traditional media outlets. Moreover, the newspaper industry, print newspapers, which remained as the most independent portion of the press, have now been forced to shut down due to the economic difficulties caused by the removal of official publicity and the lack of paper to print on.
Rápidamente,
Very quickly, this state policy, the policy that has been promoted from the state, has led to higher concentration in media ownership, lower pluralism, and lower diversity. For example, the exit of RCTV meant that now audiences had to turn to another two options, the two open broadcast television options. One was a private channel, one of the private channels, and the others were all public channels. But the majority of the viewership went to private channels. So people had now fewer options, fewer choices for watching television. In terms of radio broadcast, CONATEL, which is the regulator in charge of regulating telecommunications, is also directly responsible for, or has responsibilities for, its content. This means that it's now more difficult for certain topics to be addressed on radio and TV. For example, say the president of the National Assembly of Venezuela has not been interviewed by any radio broadcaster in Venezuela. No television station or radio station is able to interview this person. So the public has not heard his arguments. They haven't been able to compare them with the very abundant official information that, in addition to state media, also uses other platforms. In addition, in the case of Venezuela, there are a number of provisions, or used to be provisions, that regulated the frequency bands that could be held by a private owner. For instance, no individual could own more than 10% of the radio spectrum in AM or FM, or more than 25% of the radio spectrum in regional broadcasters. Now, what has happened is that after the closing of so many radio stations, the majority of these radio stations, in order to survive, need to establish partnerships with either political powers or private powers that are closely linked to state powers, either locally, regionally, or nationally. So what we have is lower diversity, lower pluralism, and we have gone from a situation where there was more pluralism and diversity to one where there is greater concentration of ownership and also fewer choices for people to be informed and to compare and contrast the information that they receive.
Okay, and then we will now move on to Mr. Fragiscatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for their testimony. My first question is a very simple one. many within the international community are anticipating a leadership transition. Could be bloody, could be nonviolent. We hope that it's nonviolent. But either way, Venezuela looks ripe for change. One certainly hopes that it's ripe for change because I think the Maduro regime has abused its authority and usurped its power, if I can put it that way. But leaving that aside, what would any such change in Venezuela from one regime to a new government mean for journalists and their safety and their ability to carry out their work? In other words, might they get caught up in possible violence if that does take place? And as we're seeing with recent reports emerging in the past few days, that outcome is, I fear, likely.
Carlos?
Well, let's see. We, and when I say we, I mean our organization, together with similar organizations, our professional associations as journalists, as well as academic institutions that investigate the matter. One of the matters that we are studying is, in a transitional process, what agenda could we propose to those responsible for this transition? And we're in the process of building that agenda. Of course, there are many risks. For example, the transition process will not change the media ecosystem overnight. In the case, for instance, of media under state control, what will be the policy to be implemented there? Will it become universal service? Will they respect pluralism and diversity? Will they aim to serve the entirety of Venezuelan society? Or will they be instrumentalized like they have been by this government? So we need to envision what to do with this enormous government media platform, including the armed forces channel, various channels of various types, some in the local sphere, some national channels, RCTV, which was nationalized, and what will happen with all of these?
While we work on the technical issues, Mr. Lanza, go ahead.
Yes. To add to the response that was underway, I believe that in a transitional scenario, we need to think of a number of strategies. The first would be to modify the legislation that restricts freedom of expression in Venezuela. We need to repeal this law, this anti-hate law, for instance, which leads to severe penalties for some who may express themselves in ways that are protected by freedom of expression, and also repeal, for instance, the crime of perjury and defamation in such a way that they do not harm journalistic speech. We would need to repair those who have lost their licenses. We need to return them their goods and their licenses so they can broadcast. Again, there are decisions, for instance, by the Inter-American Human Rights Court in this regard, which order the Venezuelan state to reinstate, for instance, the property of RCTV and to allow them to broadcast again, or to undergo due process in order to obtain a new license. We will have to establish mechanisms to protect journalism, which has been under so many attacks, and measures so that public resources are allocated in an equitable fashion vis-a-vis media outlets, for instance, and the abuse in the distribution of official advertising. And of course, to investigate the more serious violations to freedom of expression which occurred over the past 15 years and punish those responsible. These, in my opinion, are some initial mechanisms that can help us to reestablish freedom of expression in Venezuela.
It looks like we have Mr. Correa back in just 30 seconds, if you could complete your thought. Thank you.
Carlos.
No problem.
Bueno, a ver.
Yes. Okay, let's see. Basically, I think that the agenda, as I was saying, should
Está complicado.
Notado una importante es el cumplimiento de derechos humanos.
And also a series of recommendations that are part of the Inter-American Commission reports, as well as others that are contained.
Los órganos de Naciones
Our
Unidas,
sound.
y tratar de que efectivamente recuperemos.
All of these to once again recover freedom of the press.
Now we will go to Mr. Sweet for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is to Mr. Correa and Mr. Vivas. You are what we'd call a whistleblower organization, a watchdog over the present government there in Venezuela. Are you putting yourselves at risk by giving this testimony today?
Did you hear the question? I think we've lost them once more, so we'll.
Bueno, no, en líneas generales nosotros hemos.
Overall,
Otra vez
There's a long delay.
Nosotros hemos tenido los mismos riesgos.
we have been subject to the same risks that any human rights defender, any journalist, or any activist in Venezuela. Once, ongoing smear campaigns in government platforms. We have been victims of violence against our facilities. And in addition, there is an ongoing prosecution using this anti-hate law or other laws to try to restrict our work.
Implica muchas veces.
But yes, the interpreter apologizes. That was unintelligible. In the case of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the rapporteur, and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, we are part of an international body, which is the Organization of American States. And as such, we are subject to the protections afforded to international officials. Regrettably, both the Inter-American Commission and the rapporteur have requested visiting the country to observe the human rights situation and the freedom of expression situation on site, on the ground. But the government of Venezuela has not granted us authorization to enter the country. And therefore, we are working and observing the situation from abroad through reports that we receive from civil society, the public hearings that we hold every 3 or 4 months to receive the whistleblowers and victims, and also bringing forth specific cases before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and court, so that in these bodies we can discuss directly with the government of Venezuela. However, we have not been allowed to enter the country.
There's an old technology that used to be used by Radio Free Europe called shortwave radio, very hard to block, not unlike some of our newer sophisticated transmission capability. Is there any alternative communication capability being used for those journalists who have left the country to try to reach their citizens with a more of an accurate report on what's going on rather than being blocked out by the internet, etc.?
Yes, from what we know, a number of journalists who have been deported from Venezuela or expelled have attested and provided testimony of the situation they have suffered, such as arbitrary detentions, the detainment conditions that they have been subject to, and also of the material that they were covering at the time in Venezuela. For instance, today we just saw a video that was sent by the journalist Jorge Ramos, which was related to Venezuelan teenagers who were eating and feeding themselves from a garbage truck in the city of Caracas. And those images did get out, and his testimony got out. And his testimony today is that he asked the president about those images and asked him what he thought about those countries that hold that his government is a dictatorship, and for that reason he was expelled from the country.
Thank you. We will try to get Caracas back on the line with audio, not video, and if so, we'll have a few minutes for them. But now we'll go to Ms. Hardcastle for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I guess what I'd like to do now, if we could, is talk a little bit about the role for Canada and for the international community now. We know that Canada hasn't had an ambassador in Venezuela since 2017. We've had previous witnesses that suggested that Canada would have an important role, that embassies, for instance, should reach out and support journalists, local journalists. Just wondering if you have any insights into what you think could be leveraged to improve information exchange, freedom of the press, and in general, just where you think Canada could be doing a better job of supporting Venezuelans.
Sí, no sé si Carlos.
I don't know whether Carlos is available via audio or if I'm alone now.
Oh, now, Mr. Robato.
Okay. Sí. No, creo.
Well, yes, I think that the question is very important. I think that Canada has a very important hemispheric role to play throughout the region, in specifically the situation of freedom of expression in Venezuela, but also in the case of Nicaragua and in the case of Cuba. It is a very complex situation, as well as investigative journalism in other countries. Therefore, I think that once again, as it was the case 15 or 20 years ago, when Canada was very important for the creation of this very body, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. So to once again put among its priorities democracy and freedom of expression in the Americas, it would be a very important role that only Canada is in a position to play at this point. Supporting Venezuelan civil society that works on matters of civil expression is crucial for me. At this point in time. And there is also an ecosystem of digital media in Venezuela that operates both within Venezuela and outside. These are small websites that are very important to bring information in this environment of, choking of the media ecosystem that we have discussed. And perhaps there could be a specific program for digital journalism in Venezuela, to support digital journalism in Venezuela. This could be very important. Moreover, I think that this type of meeting here is very relevant. Having the Canadian House of Commons hear this situation and document this situation. And for this, we are ready to heed your call whenever it may be necessary, and to invoke Canadian media to not only cover the crisis, which is very important, the humanitarian and political crisis, but also the consequences that this is having for journalists and media outlets, and to tell Canadians what are the restrictions to freedom of speech in a manner that is more relatable. Sort of the everyday restrictions for people in Venezuela would be good for Canadians to hear.
Correa and Mr. Vivas back on the line. Did you wish for us to repeat the question? Can you hear us?
Sí, le estoy escuchando perfectamente.
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, we'll give you a few moments to respond either to the earlier question or to this one. And if you need us to repeat the question, please just indicate that and we'll do so.
Dale, perfecto, no, como quieran.
Yes, as you wish.
Go ahead.
Hola.
And complete what you were going to say when we were cut off earlier.
No,
Very well. Basically, what we were trying to answer was the question related to the risks. And yes, in fact, in Venezuela, being a journalist and doing journalism and trying to cover in a manner that is critical or independent or to defend human rights or in any way to diverge from the state line has consequences. What I was trying to say in the end is that for us, it's very important to collective action among Venezuelans is very important. We do that through a number of partnerships. Of course, our relationship with international organizations, multilateral organizations, and others, that allows us to continue to do this work and to aim to protect journalists, and all those citizens who wish to express themselves, and to provide information for Venezuelans to communicate.
Thank you. And we do have an extra few minutes. So for the last 3 minutes, Mr. Anderson.
One question, and that is that the opposition leader has risen to become the interim president of Venezuela. More than 50 governments have now recognized him. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what role has traditional or non-traditional rather media outlets played in this rapid ascendance to this position and to his capacity to be able to do the job.
Let's see. This is what I was trying to explain before. First of all, Venezuelan society is undergoing a very difficult situation, very complex, and very quickly Juan Guaido has, first, they began by doing consultations at the local level. These were personal, direct consultations and mobilizations by a number of MPs or deputies of the National Assembly. So this was interpersonal contact. This meant that this initial round of consultations was successful, and very quickly opposition sectors recognized Juan Guaido as a leader. And that leadership gave him, drove him forward. Last Saturday, there were 70 public protests throughout the country in a number of cities. This means that society is finding ways to communicate and to express themselves. I think that there is agreement between Juan Guaido's message and the aspirations of the majority of Venezuelan society, and that is why he has risen so quickly. And it is a movement that is now very expectant to see what will come out of the events in Colombia this weekend.
Do you want to add to that, Mr. Lanza? We have just 1 minute left.
I also think that for Venezuelans abroad, it has been very important to see the coverage by international media of this phenomenon embodied by Juan Guaido. And this has also provided, has cornered the de facto government in Venezuela. Therefore, freedom of expression and freedom of the press are playing a fundamental role to hopefully a pacific or peaceful, rather, solution to the situation in Venezuela.
To thank our witnesses for your courage, your very informative testimony, and your dedication. And thank you, everybody. With that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Good afternoon.